Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, welcome to an analytical session on the United States social contract evolving from a historically liberal democracy, at least insofar as the Constitution of the United States, framed in the late 18th century during the Enlightenment era, and a constitution rooted on Enlightenment era principles, into what few scholars and credible analysts would call a functional liberal democracy. This is not about a cult of personality of a single person at the head of the government. This is not about a single political party. This is about the political class behind which is the socioeconomic elite of the United States that has been taking place over a long time. And it has evolved to a situation where there is extreme political polarization that a number of scholars, even before Trump's first term, he won in 2016 to take office, I should say, in 2017. Even before that, there were scholars who argued that the historical antecedents, the antecedents for a cold civil war, were already there. Cold War, of course, took place from the Truman era. Obviously, the Truman Doctrine of 1947 put the stamp of legitimacy on the United States policy, domestic and foreign policy, creating a political economy, domestic and, of course, exporting it internationally, of rooted in Cold War politics, or the East-West confrontation, as scholars call it. A cold civil war, the Cold War lasted until 1990. Cold War simply meant that we didn't go to a hot war, pushing the button, God forbid, to have a nuclear confrontation, or actually having a conventional war. A cold civil war refers to the characteristics of a society, in this case the United States, that is highly polarized politically, very divided to the degree that there is consensus lacking by the political elites, which at one time may have been true, but it has eventually eroded. So absence of political consensus, political polarization, extreme socioeconomic polarization to the degree that a handful of people, a mere 1% on the bulk of the wealth in the United States, more than the bottom 90%. It also means that society has adapted to this new cold civil war to the degree that it has been normalized, that a segment of the population applauds it, accepts it, embraces it, and has no problem viewing the slippery slope toward elective dictatorship, authoritarianism, in other words, with a very strong executive branch invoking unitary executive theory, that minimizes the role of the legislative branch and the judicial branch, while massive power is concentrated at the executive level to the degree that it uses the power of the executive through the armed forces to send troops to places like Los Angeles in June and currently in August in Washington, D.C., and now plans to do the same in Chicago, with more than a half a dozen cities to follow, with New York as the ultimate prize after the November election, when Zoran Mamdani, the progressive Democrat, is supposed to win that election. And so the executive branch is planning to undo the will of the voters of New York City and federalize the police and, in fact, impose central government control over the city as it has in Washington, D.C., which set the precedent, by the way. In California, there was strong resistance by both the governor and the mayor of Los Angeles. So that was mitigated to some degree. Polarization that has characteristics of a cold civil war is not limited. Some people believe it's limited to GOP versus Democrats, is reflected in so many of the congressional hearings, both House and Senate hearings, and in rhetoric that comes from both Trump and top GOP leaders, as well as cabinet officials of the Trump administration versus Democrats. It's not just that. It permeates every sector of society. The cold civil war is throughout society. And it is, as Time magazine recently published an article, although unfortunately, in my view, it falls short of explaining this phenomenon. It uses the culture of fear, as Time magazine called it. But the culture of fear, scholars were using it long before Time magazine published this article, which pertains to Trump using armed troops in Washington, D.C., on the pretext of cleaning crime and cleaning homeless people, actually putting them in jail, most of them because many of these are mentally ill and they refuse to go to a facility for the homeless, so they just shove them in a jail. And by the way, the reason they, one reason they are, many of them, not all of them certainly, out on the streets, two main reasons. One is the socioeconomic structure of the United States, which has 12% of the population below poverty. That's 37 million people, by the way. 37 million people below poverty. And the other reason is, from Reagan to the present, the fact is it is very difficult to have mentally ill, especially in the working class, the poor, and the marginalized population, minority population, into a mental institution. They get rid of them. So this started back in 40 years, more than 40 years ago, during the Reagan era, when they emptied mental hospitals. And a lot of those people wound up in the streets. Now Trump wants to clean them out and put them either in a facility or in jail. And like I said, most of them wind up in jail because they refuse to go to a facility. Anyway, Time magazine's culture of fear was right on the money, but it didn't go far enough insofar as it doesn't really, it lays all the blame on Trump. And this is not to defend the president, but the fact is that I had written an article entitled Culture of Fear in America long before Trump was president, and others, I'm not taking credit, others had written about the same thing. The culture of fear concept really goes way back to the Red Scare of the McCarthy era of the 1950s. and we move forward. Now it's exacerbated by the 1980s, when we see more polarization beginning with the Reagan neoliberal era, and the GOP moving farther and farther to the right, and so were Democrats moving from the center to the center right, mainstream Democrats increasingly moving, as they embraced, as they too embraced neoliberalism, by the way, from Clinton to Obama to Biden, as well as militarism, the military industrial complex. So not much difference there. So we have to be true here. We have to be honest that this is not the Republican Party and the cult of personality of the president currently in the White House. This issue transcends the culture of fear. The Cold Civil War transcends political class. It transcends political party lines. It transcends political party labels. It is the entire political class, and that is the reality. If people have, if analysts are to provide an honest appraisal, an honest assessment of what has happened in American history in the last 50 years, they would have to look at the role of the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. Clearly, the Republicans go farther to the right. Um, and it is true that they are much more enthusiastic about authoritarianism, but in very subtle ways, the Democrats laid the groundwork for that. For example, just one quick example, and I'll go back to my analysis here. The issue with colleges and Biden and using anti-Semitism to go after universities, the top universities, and then the entire higher education system. That was Biden, and Trump is simply building on it. So if we are to be intellectually honest and not just use vacuous rhetoric to point fingers, we will look at both political parties responsible for what is happening. Now, Cold Civil War really, like I said, has its roots in, in the McCarthy era, the 1950s, when the Cold War was used as a pretext by certain fanatics on the Republican side, of course, to engender conformity, sociopolitical conformity at home. So they were using the Cold War abroad to engender conformity at home. So we have a decade of conformity in the 1950s. It starts with Truman, it continues with Eisenhower. We see, however, that this brings about a level of resistance, sociopolitical resistance, namely the civil rights movement in the 1950s, late 1950s. And then, of course, that continues and it culminates to the civil rights movement of the mid-1960s, Civil Rights Acts of 64, 65, and Martin Luther King being at the center of that, although not the only one. There are others who were involved in this very broad movement, and the anti-Vietnam peace movement as well, combined in there with the civil rights movement. So there was polarization in the early Cold War, and that seemed to create very conditions very similar to those of America in the 1860s. Obviously, Cold Civil War refers to the Civil War, the cold part to the Cold War, Civil War to the Civil War of, during the Lincoln presidency, 1860, 1865. So what we have there, however, is what many American scholars call this American Civil War, the real revolution, because structural change, systemic change took place insofar as the division of labor changed. Slavery was no more, and that was the end of slavery. And by the way, the underlying causes of the Civil War, although many like to point out that, well, you see, whites sacrificed to free blacks. Well, okay, that's on the surface. Actually, the cause is exactly as President Abraham Lincoln pointed out, the integrity of the Union. And this means that Abraham Lincoln, who was a northerner from Illinois, was a man who believed that the country must modernize, in undergo an industrial revolution like Northwest Europe, like the mother country Great Britain. And in order to do that, it needed to create a mobile labor force, and slavery has no role in that. And it must break the integration of the South to the mother country Great Britain, where it was providing raw materials, especially cotton. Cotton in the United States, in the colonies, and then in the United States until the Civil War, actually contributed enormously to the industrialization of England. King Cotton contributed to strengthening the secondary of production, sector of production in the mother country in England. So the Civil War was really about the elites in the United States, the northern elites that were interested in breaking that dependence, interested in moving forward with a manufacturing sector, making sure this country was able to compete down the road in the future with Northwest Europeans, with the mother country. As the great American historian William Appleman Williams pointed out in his book, Empire is a Way of Life, America always looked to the mother country to emulate the mother country, and the foundation for an imperial America was the secondary sector of production, that's manufacturing. So that was at the root of that Civil War. So what's at the root of this Civil War? Is it just the theatrics of rhetoric and the shallow rhetoric, the politics that and the cult of personality? No, actually, we have some similarities. There are also a lot of difference. America today is not, of the 21st century, is not in the same social, does not have the same social structure, does not have the same economic structure, does not have the same political structure as it did back in the mid 19th century. America of the early 21st century is very different, and it competes, considering that it has been at the zenith of world power, hegemonic power, since 1945, by the way, laying the foundations from World War I to the end of World War II. And then, of course, the Bretton Woods system permitted the US to impose, to help manage the world economy and impose hegemony on a world scale. However, all of this changed with the advent of neoliberalism under Reagan, and then in 1990, the end of the Soviet bloc, and the simultaneous economic integration of China in the world economy allowed for a different dynamic in world politics. And the United States, although it celebrated that it was the center of a unipolar world structure, and the US at the top of that world, the New World Order, as George Herbert Walker Bush called it, well, it was a premature celebration, because it was China that was laying the foundations for ascendancy to world power. The fact is that when we look back today, the celebrations of from 1990 to the tech bubble on Wall Street in 2000, 1999, 2000, all of that was premature. It was China that was laying the foundations, and the US was actually for the rise to worldism, the rise to being a major world power and integrating the world economy under its aegis. And I'll give you some statistics about the latest, by the way, numbers published just recently, this August 2025, about where the US GDP measured in PPP terms versus China stands. So I'll give you those numbers as well. Now, the Cold War really was not foreseen. Nobody plans a Cold War, a cold, a cold civil war, I should say. Sorry, nobody plans a cold civil war. Nobody is that devious. Um, presumably, no one wants that kind of damage inflicted on their own country. That would be treacherous. However, conditions in society, objective conditions in society, systemic structural conditions bring society to that level. So what has happened to bring us to this level? The combination of the United States neoliberal economy from Reagan to the present, not living up to the promise, in fact, replete in all sorts of contradictions where it promised one thing, it promised a panacea, Shangri-La for society, but delivered that only for, let's just go away from the 1% that Bernie Sanders always likes to talk about, that the American oligarchy holds, and let's broaden it out to the top 5%. Let's just say 5%. What about the rest? And then there's another 5% below that that's sort of a cushion. But the bottom, especially the bottom, the bottom 78% according to statistics, are not doing well at all. And we have increased socioeconomic polarization. So we start with the increased socioeconomic polarization, and then the reaction of the common person, the common working person, the common middle class person, how they react to this, and the influences that they have in their head from cultural influences, and some blaming the identity politics of liberals, that the root cause is not the neoliberal system. Many of them don't know what that is, by the way, and how it functions. Not that many politicians do either. They just go along with what the specific policies are. But the reality is that the ordinary person has the same reaction as the ordinary person in Germany, ordinary working class or middle class person. They just figure, okay, what's the solution to all this? What's best for me and people in my situation? And some opt to support a more authoritarian solution. Others a more liberal. However, what has happened to get to the cold civil war is a situation not unlike that which happened in interwar Europe with the rise of totalitarianism, and in the worst cases, of course, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, but also military dictatorships across Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, from Portugal, Spain, Greece. So what we have is the middle liberal democratic political base polarized, because they are not sure that the middle is providing solutions. That is, liberal democratic politicians are providing solutions. So they go to extremes. Those are the conditions, the preconditions for a cold civil war. Now, I want to bring up some frightening news headlines that happened just in August, to give you an indication of how bad things have become in the United States in terms of a cold civil war. This is just in August, because every single month from January to the present. And the only reason I mention this is not to single out the GOP and President Trump, because you could see, and I was just as critical, if not more so, by the way, of the Biden administration when it was in office. You can see this polarization very clearly during the Biden administration. But we deal with the present. So the in the last 8 months, and especially just this August in 2025, what we had is um, very, very clear signs of polarization deliberately created and manifested through executive orders or um, policies given, the policy directives given to the various cabinets, especially the DOJ, Department of Justice, as well as DOD, Department of Defense. And this is an indication of how this is just a brief sample, and I'm not going to go through all of it. On August 21st, 2025, the Supreme Court, under pressure from the Trump administration, and it's predominantly Republican, permitted the Trump administration to go ahead in its request to deny funding to the National Institutes of Health, NIH, for in grants for just about everything that involved minorities, marginalized people, gays and lesbians, and so forth. Now, this is really targeting identity politics. Now, this is a medical issue. Does medicine have should medicine be determined? Should medicine be weaponized? Let me just put it bluntly. Should medical science, medical research be weaponized? Does that benefit society? Does the weaponization of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, benefit America as a whole, as a country? Does denying grants to a segment of the population, namely the marginalized minorities, gays, lesbians, and so forth, how does that advance? This is a medical issue. How does that advance the progress of civilization, the progress of America? This is vindictive politics. This is politics of division, and this is an example. This is the Supreme Court going along with the Trump administration's request to deny them these grants. This is why I said at the outset that this is not an issue of a cold civil war that is confined to the head of state or to a particular party. This is the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land, going along with this, contributing to the cold civil war. Now, clearly, the constituents that the Supreme Court and the GOP are hitting, the Trump administration are hitting, are presumably, let's just say, let's take it for granted, Democratic Party constituents. Again, this is a medical issue. Is this what society has come to? Pre-Civil War conditions. On the same day, there was an announcement that debt relief to any student not meeting criteria based on what I would call MAGA principles, Make America Great Again principles. Right? What the GOP defines as its ideology these days would be denied. They would deny debt relief to anyone who doesn't meet the criteria, not to mention, of course, the very strict rules and denial of, in some cases, very strict rules, in some cases, in other cases, total denial of any kind of aid, financial aid, to foreign students. Again, the idea of a society moving forward is based from the ancient times to the present, from 5th century Athens to today, okay, to 1st century AD Rome to the present. Any society that has moved forward throughout civilization, regardless of where it is, Asia or the West, it doesn't matter, on the basis of one principle, that's cultural diffusion. Here's a society, the United States, that is denying itself the catalyst to progress. That is mind-boggling to me as a historian. Why would any society deny itself the catalyst to progress, cultural diffusion? A number of critics of this have put it more crudely. Why are you creating a brain drain, turning people away and forcing them to go to other countries and so forth? Well, the brain drain issue, in other words, taking out some of the most the finest minds from institutions of higher learning and research institutions and so forth, is usually an accusation that third world countries, we used to call the global south third world. In other words, the global south used to make about the global north, the Western countries. They would argue, we suffer because of brain drain. You take our best minds. Now the United States deliberately is engaged in a brain drain at its own expense. That is a government policy. It implements policies designed to get rid of people who can contribute everything from engineering to cancer research to what have you, architecture and so forth. The list just goes on endless. So this is indeed mind-boggling, because no scholar on this planet would argue that any society has made much progress in the absence of cultural diffusion. Okay. Now, China, Imperial China, from the ancient times to the First Opium War in 1838, some may argue that, well, yeah, not really. They too benefited from cultural diffusion. Every country that has made progress is benefited. The US is, we had enough of that. The America First implies the concept of an open society withering away. And that is also something that's causing a chasm in society, which it contributes to the Cold Civil War, because there are people on the other side who do not believe this is in the best interest of American society. On the issue of education, 8 states, at least 8 states, actually there are more, but at least 8 states have embraced adopting, that is forcing down the throats of educational institutions, a Christian nationalist, actually a Judeo-Christian nationalist curriculum using anti-Semitism as a pretext, by the way. Now, anti-Semitism, by the way, as a pretext to slither toward authoritarianism is not, contrary to what a lot of analysts and critics of Trump are saying, is not an invention of the GOP. Biden started it. It was Biden who was president when the war that Israel launched after the October attack by Hamas in an Israeli camp, which was a terrorist act, without a doubt. Again, I agree with Antonio Guterres of the Secretary General of the United Nations that we have to take this into a historical context. I agree with that. Nevertheless, there was a war that followed, which very few people today, end of August, would deny is a war of genocide, including more and more Israeli press, former Israeli officials, Israeli scholars. Few deny. Just a few weeks ago, a few months ago, no, it's not genocide. Now, few would argue that it's not genocide. The evidence is overwhelming. The evidence is overwhelming. Yet, the identification of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism that was started by Biden, weaponized by Trump, has allowed the United States government, again, this is continuity of policy, to exacerbate the Cold Civil War because it's going after dissidents in violation of the First Amendment, in violation of the Constitution of the United States. Another underlying cause of the Cold Civil War. Now, well, I have talked about this, and I will do a separate session on anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, but for the fact is that the states adopting such a curriculum, far right-wing Christian nationalist curriculum, instead of a pluralist, by the way, U.S., according to the Constitution, separation of church and state, this is not in line with the Constitution. What these states are doing is not in line with the U.S. Constitution. Okay? And using anti-Semitism as a pretext to do this is hypocritical because some of these same people, by the way, are anti-Semitic. That is the irony of it. Now we come to the redistricting. Oh no, I'll talk about the redistricting later. The redistricting issue of Texas and California, I'll come to that. Now, the question, of course, that many analysts have delved into this issue. By the way, the concept, I try to find out what individual or individual was responsible for originating the concept of Cold Civil War, and I couldn't. I did an artificial intelligence search. I did all kinds of searches. Now maybe maybe there is someone, but the search results I received from, again, even including artificial intelligence searches, were the search results were that it's just out there in the domain, and that various people on a world scale all over the world use the term, have been using this term historically. Now the question is, what are the superficial causes as they're explained in the mass media versus the real causes? And the superficial causes, I'll leave that to the mass media and to social media. The real causes really seem to be the downward mobility on a chronic basis in the last 50 years of the American working class and the middle class. Historically, what we have in the capitalist system is, unless there is a strong working class, you're not going to have a strong middle class. And unless you have a strong middle class, you're not going to have a viable liberal democracy. This is why no independent organization ranking the United States as a functional democracy ranks it that way. They rank it at best as a flawed democracy. That's at best, by the way, as a flawed democracy. Okay. Now, if they conduct end of summer of 2025, it will not even make it that high up as a flawed democracy. It will probably be a notch below that. But in any case, so the chronic downward mobility of social mobility in America is really a root cause for the socio-political mobilization and for the For many people in the middle class and the working class, becoming alienated, disillusioned with the country, some accepting a large percentage, their statistics from 40 to 50, 60%, sorry, 40 to 60% saying, authoritarianism gradually becoming the norm, maybe the solution. Anything that can save us would be fine. Okay. So a lot of them buy the rhetoric that authoritarianism is the solution. An alarmingly large number, either they buy it or they are settled in it. They say, well, this is how things are. What can I do about it? I'll just go to work this morning and that's it. Mind my own business. So this apathy is what the political elites and Wall Street is counting on to continue with what they have been doing, by the way. Another reason, and this is very, very important, for the slippery slope to authoritarianism is that the chronic social mobility and the gap between the very rich and the rest, with a 12% poverty line, by the way, poverty level, 37 million out of roughly 350 million people in the United States, higher than China. China, by the way, just for the record, a number of years ago, Xi Jinping proudly announced eradicated extreme poverty. One party state, clearly Communist Party, but they eradicated extreme poverty. So the social development progress of China is something that has been enviable for many countries in the global south, and they point to it, by the way. The entire continent of Africa, as many know, now more and more in Latin America, the entire Latin American continent, they look to the Chinese for global leadership moving ahead in the 21st century, not to the United States. Another issue, underlying cause for the Cold Civil War is the demographics of America. This has been discussed by sociologists, political scientists, historians, economists. When we look at the demographics of America, I mean, this topic has been in scholarly literature, of course, for a long time. What we see is that today, 2025, just about 1/3 of the American population of 350 million people are blacks. First, Hispanics, that's the largest minority, by the way, just for the record, and then blacks. In 20 to 30 years, by 2020, 50, 2060, somewhere in there, the expectation is that this minority population, Hispanics and blacks, will be the majority. So the US will resemble if white elites control the political class and Wall Street, right? It will resemble Nelson Mandela, South Africa. That's how the United States is going to be in a generation. Okay, and that is a problem. So there is the issue of demography here. There is not that, by the way, the Europeans are not concerned about the same thing. Of course, they're concerned about blacks and Muslims in Europe, and they're concerned about whites becoming a minority. I mean, countries like France, Germany, and so forth. They're thinking, "Oh my God, we're gonna lose our whiteness and our Eurocentric value system and identity." Well, there is that aspect of it on the part of the American elites, predominantly white, Anglo-Saxon, and Jewish. Those too are concerned about the demographic map of the country. They can read statistics as well as anybody. So they're looking at this and they're thinking, okay, what do we do about it? So authoritarianism behind the thin veil of electoral politics, not democracy. It's not democracy. This is not a democracy. Behind the thin veil of authoritarian of democracy, liberal democracy, authoritarian policies, having troops, by the way, carrying guns, federal troops, in cities in Washington, D.C., is not what a Norwegian government would do, or a Swedish government, or a Danish government, or a Dutch government, or Japanese government. They're not going to do that. Okay? That's not democracy. And planning to do the same thing with Chicago next, headed for New York after Mamdani presumably wins the election in November, that's democracy. Obviating the will of the voter, that's not democracy. Anyway, the question here is that the United States is polarized in part because the white elites in the political class and socioeconomic class are well aware that down the road, the demographics of America will alter. So polarization, by the way, they try to instill this fear. This is the time, going back to the Time magazine, which is very focused, very limited, Culture of Fear article recently on Donald Trump, which in my view, they should have broadened out. They should not have targeted just Donald Trump. They should have had him in terms of where he fits into the line and the continuity. And that's about it, instead of just, well, it's just him. It's not just him. There's a whole historical so we have a situation of polarization because because a segment of the masses, including working class whites, by the way, have embraced culture wars, and instead of looking at the structural impediments to their own progress in their own lives, they're pointing to gays and lesbians and blacks and Hispanics and immigrants from Guatemala and so forth as the anathema for society, as though they are the underlying cause, rather than to look at where the real causes rest for the calamities they have suffered in their downward pressure living standards. It's not some Guatemalan woman cleaning hotels in Los Angeles, and it's certainly not some gay or lesbian person wanting to pursue a lifestyle choice. That's not who is responsible for the downward pressure. It is the structure of the neoliberal political economy that has resulted in socioeconomic polarization, which has brought us sociopolitical polarization and cold civil war conditions. Now, we have seen some extreme examples recently, and because this was just in the news a couple of days ago, I have to mention it. Their highly symbolic raiding of John Bolton's home, the former national security advisor to President Trump in the first term, a Republican, by the way. They raided his home. I believe he was out in Bethesda, Maryland. He lives out there. And that highly symbolic raid by the FBI, and of course, as much as he tried to stay calm and say, well, I expected it. They did this to me. They did that. Well, this really sending the FBI after the former national security advisor. I'm not defending Bolton, by the way, but sending the FBI to raid his home at 7 o'clock in the morning and to look for some computer chip and to allege that he's had illegal ties to foreign elements, financiers, and British elements that is somehow violation of U.S. law. Okay, fine. There's a process to do that. There's a process to do that. Now, this was highly symbolic, and it's part of the signal. It's part of the culture of fear that so many mainstream media articles have dealt with, by the way. But it's also to send a signal to society, as the director of the FBI said, nobody's above the law. Nobody should be above the law. But the question is, what if we have a situation which always, when I come to this, I'm reminded of an Italian, a great Italian film of the 1970s, Investigation of a Citizen Above Suspicion. A situation where the political class representing socioeconomic elites is above the law. And then they decide who the targets are. Those are conditions for cold civil war. Because as the other side has said, when they come to office, they will retaliate in some respect. So this is really deleterious. This is an ancient Greek word which means poisonous. This is a poisonous route to conducting policy, and it gains nothing. The worst of it, of course, is what happened with Texas and with and California responding. That is, Texas under Trump's orders deciding to redistrict so they can gain more House seats, so that they can deny the Democrats the majority in the House, so Trump can proceed with what he has been doing in the first 8 months in office. California immediately responded. Gavin Newsom, who has presidential ambitions, not exactly a progressive Democrat, a mainstream neoliberal, by the way, who, in my view, will be no different than Biden. Just the theatrics are different, but in substance, he wouldn't be no different than Biden. This is not to castigate him. Just that's the way. That's he's been involved in all kinds of things in California. His policy speaks for itself. In any event, California will engage in redistricting as well. And here is the example of the two mainstream parties, by the way, both representing Wall Street, both representing the military-industrial complex, involved in this head-on collision, which only exacerbates the tendency to normalize authoritarianism. And that is a very, very bad example. And I am going to bring up one more issue after the Texas and California, and that is the question of a cabinet official that Trump appointed. His name is Bill Pulte. Bill Pulte is the head of the Federal Housing Finance Authority, which is in charge of overseeing $7.7 trillion in loans, in public loans. Bill Pulte he's the grandson of the Pulte family that's in construction, finance, real estate, very famous family in America. Gave a lot of money to Republican causes, to Trump and to Republicans, and he secured this position. This position, being in charge of this position, of course, obviously is related to his family's real estate / financial / real estate interests, and Trump has such people, more such people in the cabinet. Bill Pulte has actually contributed to the Cold Civil War in the sense that, according to lawsuits filed against him, he has targeted minorities, women, and he has the latest target was the one of the Federal Reserve Board, the only black woman on the Federal Reserve. Her name is Lisa Cook, who's a black woman, by the way. He targeted her. He targeted her as well, and Trump immediately said, "Let's just fire her." Obviously, on orders from Trump. So Ponte has been used by the Trump administration to exacerbate um, the cold civil war in America. There are other people like that. The Secretary of Education is another such person. You can go one after another in cabinet secretaries, and that's who they are. The policies they follow are to target minorities, target marginalized populations, target the working class, target enemies, and freely make no apologies about bypassing the courts, bypassing due process, and using unitary executive theory, that is authoritarian tactics, to impose policies in the name of how dare you question the president, although obviously Congress, the United States Constitution, set up Congress elected by the people. Not that the president isn't, but the president is indirectly elected by the people. It's elected by the Electoral College. Um, the Constitution set up the Congress to be the strongest branch of government in the checks and balances system, not the president, because the founding fathers had concerns about an imperial authority at the executive in the age of kings, of absolute kings in the 18th century. So, what we have here is a situation of a cold civil war manifesting itself in all the cabinets of the government. And then that has invited a response, a counter measured response. For example, in California, Governor Newsom took the position of, if you do this, we'll respond, and then we'll have more House seats than you. We'll take over the House. This sort of back and forth um, only leads to the acceptance of authoritarianism as the new normal in America. This is not democracy. These sorts of tactics are the sorts of tactics that go beyond the boundaries of the constitutional perimeters. The attack of the government currently, the Trump government, on institutions from higher education to museums in Washington, D.C., to the Kennedy Center, which is a monument to John Kennedy, to sending troops to cities like Los Angeles and D.C., and planning to do the same with more than a half a dozen cities. All of these signals, alarm bells should be going up. The alarm bells are that the United States is living through an era of transition. And this transition is from a liberal democracy to authoritarianism. Like I said, no serious, credible scholar would argue that the United States is a functioning liberal democracy, at best flawed, and if that, given the conditions that have prevailed. One concluding remark: where is all this headed? This is not going to end well anytime soon. Unfortunately, after the November election in New York City, there are many who fear, and I agree with them, that the situation is going to get ugly in New York. Mamdani will force a number of mainstream Democrats to come to his side. Mamdani is a progressive New Deal Democrat, although he calls himself socialist. That's fine. People are free to call themselves anything they want. He's a New Deal Democrat, just like Bernie Sanders. And a number of mainstream Democrats will come to his aid. That's when there will be a major clash, because New York is the center. Although Washington, D.C. is the political center, New York is really the center of power in America, the center of Wall Street. That's where Wall Street is, the center of financial power. And Trump, a New Yorker, okay, will intervene in New York. And that is when this new cold civil war, as it's unfolding, will probably go into the next phase, and it will not be a good situation in terms of strengthening, but rather weakening democracy even more, and going down the slippery slope even more toward authoritarianism. I thank you for watching. I ask you to write comments and questions, and by all means, join this channel. Thank you very much.